Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you. I'm standing in from Catherine Donnelly. She's had a family emergency, so it's my pleasure to be here to welcome you. Before we get started, I would like to do a land acknowledgement and acknowledge on this very windy day that Queens is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. And we are grateful to live, work, and play on these very special lands. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Heather Stuart. She is the Bell Canada Chair in Mental Health and Anti-Stigma Research, the first ever chair of such in Canada. As well, she's a professor and colleague in the Department of Public Health Sciences and Department of Psychiatry and Rehabilitation Therapy. She has worked in both hospital and community-based mental health treatment systems and with international agencies such as the World Health Organization. We are very privileged to have Dr. Stuart here to speak with us today, and importantly, to acknowledge that Dr. Stuart was named to the Order of Canada, inducted as a Fellow in the Royal Society of Canada. So without further ado, Heather, I will turn it over to you to share your words of wisdom.
Thanks, Joan. That was a great introduction. I'm just going to take a minute and share my screen, if I can do that. Let's just see how that works.
As Heather's getting set up, please, I encourage you to put questions or comments in the chat, or we will have time for questions afterwards. Once I've shared my screen and I'm on this mode, I don't see the chats anymore. They just disappeared. So if somebody could read the questions out to me, that would be great. It's a quirk of this system. I don't know why it does that, but anyway, so I'll get underway. What I thought I'd talk to you about today is one component of the work that I do and the work that is funded through the Bell Chair. And I titled it The Nature and Nurture of Mental Illness Related Stigma. And I do want to talk about some of the concepts behind stigma, but also some of the things that we're doing to address it. And I thought a good place to start would be with a tour of terms. So stigma is now used as an umbrella construct. It didn't used to be, but it's now an umbrella construct. And it includes a cognitive component, so it's how people label and stereotype others, in this case, people with a mental illness. It includes an emotional component, so there's a generalized negativity and full-blown prejudice at times. There's a behavioral component, which is the unfair treatment and discrimination. And more recently, people are becoming interested in the structural components of stigma. And these are acts of commission, acts of omission, and power imbalance. So an act of commission would be something like denying someone's civil or human rights. Oops, for whatever reason, this is moving. So for example, not allowing people to vote. An act of omission would be allowing people to vote, but not putting any ballot boxes in psychiatric hospitals, so they can't access the voting privilege. And then, of course, all of this occurs in a power imbalance. Only powerful groups can stigmatize and marginalize people. Notice I didn't mention mental health literacy or mental illness literacy. I see that more as an outcome of stigma rather than as a component of the definition. We know that people who have a lot of knowledge about mental illness, like healthcare providers, for example, are among some of the most stigmatizing groups in society. At least that's what our consumer colleagues tell us. So this quote came out of a Canada-wide review of the mental health system that was done by Senator Kirby and Keon under the Standing Senate Committee. And what it said is rather, I think is rather poignant, is I'd rather have cancer than I wouldn't have to face the stigma. And I've known people who have had cancer and have subsequently then had depression. And when they've been in hospital with cancer, they get lots of flowers, phone calls, visitors. Subsequently, when they're in hospital with their depression, not a soul visits, no flowers arrive in the hospital room, and nobody visits or leaves messages for them. And it's like night and day. So it gives you the sense of how difficult stigma can be for people when they'd rather prefer it to, they prefer cancer to it. So I just want to set the context for what's going on in the field. In the last 15 or 20 years, the public health importance of mental illness has been recognized at an international level through the Global Burden of Disease study, which showed that 5 of the 10 top leading causes of disability adjusted life years were because of mental and substance use disorders. And if you group those into one category, they become the top ranking disability group. We know, and many organizations have made declarations that stigma is a major barrier to recovery. World Health Organization for sure, World Psychiatric Association, World Association of Social Psychiatry. So it's getting on people's radars. In 1996, the World Psychiatric Association launched a presidential program. Every new president has the ability to launch an initiative. Excuse me, and they called this Open the Doors, and it was a global program to fight stigma against schizophrenia. And I was lucky enough to be part of that program as it was getting off the ground. And Canada was the pilot site for the program. So we were trying out all of their ideas, making as many mistakes as we could, and reviewing what our work so that we would learn from those mistakes. At some point, we decided that there were a lot of people working across the world, and we needed to have a way for people to get together. So we launched a Together Against Stigma conferences. The first conference was just simply the people from the Open the Doors program. And then as we moved over in time, more and more people became involved in the conferences, and they migrate from city to city. And I'll show you that in just a minute. And then in 2005, we decided that given the prominence and the work going on in the field, the World Psychiatric Association needed to have a scientific section relating to stigma. The WPA works on theme-based sections, and it has about 65 of them. And there hadn't been one on stigma. So in 2005, the General Assembly ratified a stigma section. I was a co-founder of it. I've subsequently chaired it, and I'm currently the secretary for the section. In Canada, in 2007, following the Kirby report, the Mental Health Commission of Canada was created. And one of the pillars of activities in the Mental Health Commission was a stigma reduction. And that was done under the auspices of the Opening Minds Anti-Stigma Initiative. And that got off the ground in 2009. But between 2007 and 2009, there was a lot of preparatory work going on. And I've been a senior consultant to Opening Minds and involved with the commission even before Opening Minds around the anti-stigma work. At that point, there was really no population-based data on stigma. And that's a problem for program evaluators, because if we don't have any population-based data, we can't make a case that it's a big problem that needs to be addressed to policymakers and funders who don't want to give us any money. And we also don't know where to target our program initiatives because we don't know where the problems lie. So it really does undermine our ability to do anything. And at the same time, program development and evaluation was in its infancy. Typically what would happen is a family who had lost someone to suicide or mental illness would set up a foundation and start doing work in the field. And they didn't really know what the what available evidence there was. They didn't have a sense for why they were doing what they were doing. A lot of it, what they were doing was cathartic. And subsequently, we've discovered as we've done more evaluation that a lot of what was going on in the field was wrong. It was actually creating more stigma than it was solving. So here's just a snapshot of the Together Against Stigma conferences. The first one was in Leipzig in Germany, and that was all the Opening the Doors crew. And then subsequently, we did one in Canada, and it was about 100 people that came. Canada's seen as a little bit out of the way for a lot of Europeans. Next was Istanbul, then London, Ottawa again, Canada, Tokyo, San Francisco, Copenhagen, and Singapore. We're thinking our next one may be someplace like Iceland or Prague. What you can see there is over time, as more and more people are getting interested, not too many people went to Copenhagen. It was considered quite out of the way and expensive for many. And many times what happens is we go to areas of the world where people are trying to get large-scale anti-stigma initiatives off the ground. So it gives them a lot of visibility and prominence. So Singapore was a good example of that, Tokyo, San Francisco. So the next one, one was supposed to happen during the pandemic and that got canceled. The next one we're hoping will be face-to-face in 2023 or 2024. Okay, so a little bit about my work now. I've come at this like a pair of bookends. On the one hand, looking at measurement issues to try to get a sense of the scope and magnitude of the problem in the population. And then the other thing is the best practices. So it's all well and good to, I'll say, howl at decision makers about how big the problem is. But if you don't have solutions that you can offer to help solve the problem, you won't get much traction with them. So on the one hand, we want to document the problem, but on the other hand, we want to create an evidence base for best practices. Most of the time it felt like this though. You know, we always sanitize the work we do and make it seem so linear, but really I think in this area, because there was so little you know, stuff going on, is we were just running around in every direction at some point, and some of it paid off and some of it didn't. And so we collected a lot of lessons learned as we went through the process. And looking back over the last 10 or 15 years, I think we did learn a lot, and we did make some really important headway into the problem through you know, the international and national organizations that I've been working with. Okay, so the measurement piece. So documenting the scope and magnitude of the problem. Initially, Michelle and I worked with Dr. Rumen Malev in Psychiatry, and we developed an inventory of stigma experiences. And what we were trying to do is ask people who had experienced a mental illness what it was like for them and what were the impacts. Previously, any population or survey work that had been done had been asking members of the general public what their attitudes were. But we were thinking that if we want to document progress over time, you know, we're going to be doing a lot of anti-stigma work. What we really need to be able to do is say that people who have experiences of stigma are noticing improvement. And that ought to be the acid test for population-based interventions. So we tested the inventory. We had one for consumers, people who use services, and their family members. And we did some psychometric work on a very small sample that we collected from Dr. Malev's clinic and from conferences that we attended. And then when the Mental Health Commission emerged, Statistics Canada was put in a position of trying to support what they were doing. And at this point, they had done very little in the way of collecting population data about mental illness. And through Mike Kirby, who was the CEO of the chair of the board of the Mental Health Commission, he lobbied very hard with Statistics Canada to get a stigma module included in their survey so that we could get that kind of population data that we needed. And preparatory to that, I worked with Statistics Canada and I took the items out of the inventory that we had created, and we did some cognitive testing and some quantitative testing. We also picked an attitude survey from the literature that we were going to incorporate as well. And then once we got the modules into good shape, the Mental Health Commission paid for a rapid response survey. And what these are you can piggyback content onto the core content of the community health survey, and they'll collect your content for about 2 weeks. And then they'll give you all of the data that they've collected through the CCHS, as well as the core content that you wanted. But after a certain point in time, they also make it publicly available. So they embarked with our sponsorship on 2-month data collection, and in 2010, and the data became available to us in December through the Queen's RDC system. So we were able to have first crack at the analysis. This was something that was very difficult initially for the Mental Health Commission to understand, because they paid for the data and they didn't understand why they couldn't have it. And so, you know, those kinds of issues, eventually we came to, you know, an understanding about why that was important, and then they were able to live with it. So the empirical objectives for the rapid response was to estimate the point prevalence of depression devaluation. Now, Stats Canada was interested in depression. So we were able to have this devaluation discrimination scale that was originally developed many, many years ago and used widely throughout the field to describe the magnitude of discriminatory attitudes expressed by Canadians toward people with depression. And this is a form of public stigma. What we do know is that stigma differs depending on diagnostic group. So how people think about those with a psychotic illness is quite different than how they think about people with depression. And it turns out that in population surveys, attitude surveys, depression is one of the least stigmatized conditions. So you can kind of use that as a touchstone. If you see that there's a lot of stigma associated with depression, you can bet that there's a lot more associated with some of the other diagnostic groups. And then we wanted to estimate the one-year period prevalence of stigma impact on those who had received mental health treatment in the previous year. We picked the previous year because, again, we're always thinking that this should be a population outcome. And so if you ask for a lifetime, you know, in your life, have you been stigmatized? As you roll out population-based anti-stigma programs, you're never going to see any change because it's just accumulating over a lifetime. And that's something that a lot of countries have done, is they've gone for lifetime measures, forgetting that they really need to be able to document change over time. And then we wanted to explore factors from the limited set of variables that were in the data set that might be associated with either depression devaluation or stigma impact. So the perceived discrimination and devaluation scale was originally developed by Link in 1987 and has been used in almost every population survey since. It asks people what they think most people would do, not what they would do. So it's a measure of community level stigma, community level attitudes. And they deliberately did this to avoid social desirability bias, because as you continue to develop and roll out anti-stigma programs, what you're really doing is teaching people what they should and shouldn't say. But if you ask them, what do you think everyone in your community is doing, you get a much better assessment of what the level of stigma might be. It's originally a 12-item scale, but Statistics Canada didn't have the time in their survey to allow us to use all of the items. So with Bruce Link's approval, we adapted it to 6 items. And then the stigma impact scale that we developed, which they retitled into the mental health experiences scale. If you're ever looking for it in their data sets, that's what it's called. So again, initially it measured personal impact of stigma in 10 life domains. However, again, because of time, we were allowed 3 minutes in the survey. 10 items came down to 5 items, and the family version was not included. So all we were able to do was see what people who were users were, service users were doing. And here's what we found. The depression devaluation. So almost 60% of Canadians thought that other Canadians would devalue or discriminate against people with depression in one or more of these other domains. And of course, the closer you get to one's personal space, the higher the stigma. So people, almost 40% of the sample said they wouldn't date someone with depression. This is rather surprising because depression is a very prevalent illness, and most people have someone that they know or some experience with it. When we looked at factors that might be associated, we found this close contact. So the more you had contact with someone, a friend or a family member, the more likely you were to say that others would stigmatize them, because probably based on their experiences. And also if you had poor mental health. We recognize that this model didn't fit the data at all. It's a poor fit, it explained none of the variants. So what that is telling us is that we really don't know yet what the factors are that provoke this depression devaluation. Here's the stigma impact scale. So interesting, it's not the housing necessarily or the finances, but the family and romantic interactions that count the most. And again, close to 40% identified stigma in one or more of these areas. So that's interesting, it's high, but it also tells us that a good proportion of people don't experience stigma and haven't in the previous year. So that's can be encouraging. And here's what happens when you look at it by age group. The younger people are the most likely to report that they've been stigmatized in the previous year, and the older folks over age 45, least likely. And it's a nice dose response curve. We're not sure why this happens, but our speculation is that people usually have their onset of illness before the age of 25, so their first episode. And that's the time when they get slapped with their friends and family distancing themselves and being bullied and made fun of at school. And perhaps over time, people learn how to manage the stigma that they're experiencing and become resilient. An alternate and creepier explanation is that they don't manage at all, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And these are the ones that are most likely to suicide or die over time. So they're out of the cohort. I'm thinking it's more an issue of resilience, because I've met so many people that have been able to overcome stigma in their lives, and they can give other people tips and traps on how to do it. Here are the items that were associated. You can see age, just as the way I explained. And again, self-reported mental health. This explains a little bit more of the variance, but again, most of what's driving this, we don't know. It's still to be learned. But at least we were able to target programs and use this to identify the magnitude of this in the population. So, most anti-stigma work had been conducted without the benefit of this information. And with that stigma module, the impact module, Canada was the first country with population-based data describing the impact of stigma by people who had been treated for mental illness. Subsequently, people started to get on board and realize that this was a good thing to do. So we saw some other surveys come out, but typically they survey people who are using mental health services. They don't think about, the ones that might be recovered and out in the population. We thought that the stigma module would provide a rich source of data in subsequent national surveys so that it could be used as a form of surveillance. But Statistics Canada has only ever done one mental health survey since that time. And it was included, but it was so close to the 2012 survey, it was unlikely that we demonstrated any change, but we did see some small improvements. So we need them to do another one soon, and hopefully they will. So the fact that we could do this and fit it into a population survey means that it's an important structural change for population surveillance initiatives. And we all know, we say it all the time, that what gets counted is what counts. So this gives us a tool to do that. So the second bookend then is offering some solutions. And we've done with my colleagues, Julio, my husband, and Norman Sartorius, who was the one that started the Open the Doors campaign from World Psychiatric Association. We basically codified all of the lessons we learned from that initiative. It spawned into about 25 countries, and we made a lot of mistakes, and we did a lot of things right. So paradigms lost, we were arguing to most of the national anti-stigma programs. We were trying to bust the old ways of doing things, because they were doing things that we had learned were not very effective. We were asked to do a second edition. It's going to be out in May, I think. I worked on my sabbatical on this. This time, we talked about the paradigms lost. We summarized those, but most of the field had shifted already, and they were doing the kinds of things that we were recommending. And so we also wanted to include the paradigms found, the new ways of doing things that had emerged over the previous decade or so. So that's basically our attempt to offer processes for people who want to develop and evaluate anti-stigma programs. And what we came up with were a series of insights, guidances for people. In the old paradigm, stigma is considered to be a result of ignorance and misinformation. And all you really need to do is give people facts, and it'll, the prejudice will evaporate and the discrimination will go away. And we know that doesn't happen. So now in the paradigm that's found, we know that stigma occurs at multiple reinforcing levels: individual, interpersonal, and structural, and that programs have to be targeted to each of these levels in order to make improvements. In the old paradigm, stigma was considered to be generic and homogeneous across large populations. What we now know is it's very culturally specific, it's locally applied, and it differs depending on the mental conditions considered. So the programs need to be quite targeted if you're going to make a difference. In the old paradigm, stigma was manifest as a social blemish that marked the bearer, often considered to be synonymous with an attitude or prejudice. And critics and lots of the consumer movement objected to this because they felt that the victim was being blamed here, rather than the social structures and the people that were stigmatizing. So now we argue that stigmatization is a process of social oppression that is based on prejudice and discrimination, and that we should think of it in a social justice way. In the old paradigm, people were almost paralyzed if they didn't have scientific evidence. But as I told you, there wasn't much scientific evidence. So we were finding that we were in a catch-22. We couldn't get anything off the ground because we didn't have evidence, and we didn't have evidence because we didn't have research. So what we decided to do is, given these gaps, we would talk to people who had a mental illness and their relatives and find out what their priorities were. And often if they made a list of priorities, we could address some of the things on the list, and it was quite feasible to do that. In the old way, the target was the general population, but we argue that sharply defined groups within the population needed to be the target of anti-stigma programs. We want to see police officers doing different things than emergency room nurses than we want for secondary school teachers. So one size doesn't fit all anymore. And people have to recognize that and start to define the groups they're targeting and learn a lot about the groups and why they're stigmatizing. The general population approach really supported large social marketing projects with considerable external funding. And all of the work that we did, and others as well, demonstrated that these actually don't work. They don't even effectively change attitudes, and we know that attitudes don't predict behaviors. So we argued for small, locally situated programs and networks of programs that manage with modest budgets. And we've done a lot of courses across the world on how to set up an anti-stigma program on a shoestring budget. And, insisting that you need tons of funding to do something is just another way of saying, I don't feel like doing it right now. But, there are things people can do without money or on volunteer resources. In the old paradigm, these social marketing campaigns were usually bursts of activity that didn't last or more than about 5 years because the funding was so enormous, they couldn't maintain their funding. What we thought was, it would be better to have activities that could be more sustained, incorporated as a routine part of what organizations do. And we've been successful in doing that. So the overarching goals of the old paradigm was to improve knowledge and attitudes. We said we need to improve life chances and social inclusion. And that's really consistent with the way international conventions and legislations have emerged. The benchmarks of success are no longer self-reported knowledge and attitudes, but changes in discriminatory behaviors and structural inequities that are reported by people who are experiencing mental health problems. In the past, programs were not systematically evaluated. They were just simply assumed to work because if people felt strongly enough about their importance, then they had to work. But we argued that systematic evaluations was needed in order to create best practice evidence, because if we didn't have this evidence, we would never be able to sway funders. And part of the evidence was making sure that things got published, because that's how they get into the narrative and systematic reviews. In the past, people with mental illnesses were the recipients and beneficiaries of anti-stigma programs, almost like a charity model. but we thought that they should be active participants and leaders. And throughout the world, many programs have done this, and they've demonstrated that this is really quite able to be demonstrated. Role of mental health professionals, they were the purveyors of clinical knowledge and leaders of anti-stigma programs. Now we realize that they should be targets of anti-stigma activities and partners in community-based work. I always get a group of medical students every year saying that they want to do anti-stigma programs, and their idea is to go to a classroom and help secondary students understand the biology of mental illness. It's just, and I do my best to talk them out of it, but many times they go anyways. In the old paradigm, the factual and didactic knowledge was given. It was driven by what experts thought about the biological basis of mental illness. We've since had colleagues demonstrate that the more biology people know, the larger the social distance gap. They sort of see them as not able to recover. Their brains are damaged in some way, and they don't want them in their families because there's a genetic taint. Our approach is experiential and active. It's driven by personal recovery stories and personal contact. And it's done in a very specific and particular way. People are trained, they have work on their stories, they're able to answer questions, and they can create a transformative learning experience. In the old paradigm, we had to ensure protections against coercion, abuse, and loss of freedom. So that was when people were involuntarily admitted to mental hospitals without due process, for example. And around the world, that still happens a lot, and people are still chained to trees. But those are protection of negative rights, so coercive. And now what we want to do is we want to promote social inclusion. We want to protect the negative rights, but we also want to expand to make sure that people have equitable access to housing, employment, disability support. So these are termed in the legal world as positive rights. We, with regard to organization of services, we wanted increased access to community care because we just thought community care would automatically destigmatize people, but it actually didn't. So now we're talking about recovery-oriented care, or in other parts of medicine, person-centered care, and helping people on a pathway of recovery and meaning-making. So that was essentially where we were, and we've, with the Mental Health Commission, is we've used all of those guiding principles to formulate programs and implement them in the community, and they've worked. We've almost used Canada as a case study for those ideas. So that's the strain of activities that I have when it comes to stigma and stigma reduction. But I also wanted to let you know about some other things that we've been working on in my program of research. We work with Bell Canada in a number of different ways, not just in the stigma. We've helped them develop and test programs for school-age students, for teachers. I serve as a subject matter expert for their Bell Let's Talk advertisements each year. With Morneau Chappell, at Bell's insistence, we've developed a certificate program. Morneau Chappell delivers the program, and Queen's provides a certificate if an exam can be passed. Still working quite heavily with the World Psychiatric Association Stigma section, and we just recently completed a position paper that we hope will be ratified by the General Assembly and be housed on the WPA website. I've mentioned a little bit about the Mental Health Commission of Canada and the anti-stigma work that we're doing. We're focusing a lot now on structural stigma. We're thinking about how to evaluate mental health first aid, because we're not sure that it's promoting a recovery focus. So we want to know how we could improve it. That's a program that was developed in Australia, and it's manualized and it's strictly governed by the people that developed it. We're also looking at a stigma report card. So we've decided not to wait for Statistics Canada. We're just going to go ahead and do our own. We've worked with different community groups to develop and evaluate programs. And one example, recent example, is called an ASK program. It was a program, a gatekeeper program for St. Lawrence College. We're just in the final throes of getting a paper published on that. I've worked with Iris, the Dragon Charity. They develop books for young people trying to explain mental illness, trying to explain stigma, trying to explain the pandemic. And we've had students working with them on some of their projects to help them understand whether what they're doing is doing what they think it's doing. Reflection of the global interest in stigma reduction, the Lancet journal that you probably all know has developed a commission on mental health, and I'm involved in writing group 1. There's about 10 writing groups doing different facets of stigma. Group number 1 is defining the terms and making definitions. I've worked with Mental Health Research Canada and their polling data, which they've been doing since the outset of the pandemic. I've got lots of data. They're very willing to share it. So if anybody is looking for student projects, let me know, and go to their website, download one of their reports and see if there's anything interesting there. Been working with Workplace Strategies for Mental Health. They're collecting a lot of data as well, which I also have access to. And we're working with them right now to try to validate one of their survey instruments to see if we can't improve it a little bit. I'm helping Brooke with the Student Mental Health Network as one of her content experts, and this is a fantastic thing that she's done, and I hope you'll hear about it next year sometime, or maybe sooner, hopefully. The Centers for Learning and Research and Innovation in Long-Term Care, they're trying to implement a workplace standard for psychological safety in long-term care facilities, so I've been doing some consulting with them. I've been involved with Grand Challenges in Depression in UCLA as a stigma reduction expert with some of the people from the stigma section and people like Bruce Link, who are legendary in our field. And then most recently, I'm working with a number of agencies here in Kingston, and we were running a Cooking Connections program. So we have cooking agencies, mental health agencies. We're providing anti-stigma training that the people get after they've cooked a meal and they're sitting around at a table eating, and we go in and we talk about stigma with them. Our preliminary evaluation has shown that it has brought about transformative change for a lot of people who've been bumping around in the mental health system for years. And the big thing that seems to be connecting with them is the notion of self-stigma, that a lot of the barriers that they erect are erected by themselves. And if they think about it, they can find out ways of overcoming public stigma, but to hide away because they're afraid of being stigmatized is just not the way to do it. So that's been very promising. The pandemic put the skids to that. We're just now starting to get it up and running again. And we're engaging students from the rehabilitation sciences to help us with some of the content development, the toolkits that we want to be able to give to the people who are taking the courses. And we're hoping to enroll about 200 to 250 people in various parts of Kingston and outlying areas, and do a very more systematic quantitative evaluation than what we've been able to do today. Up to now, we've been doing qualitative work with these people. Looking forward, I think that we're going to be working as a field for better evidence for anti-stigma intervention research, and developing community research partnerships to do this. We want to understand more about theories of change. This has been an area that's been really lacking. What are the active ingredients in these interventions? Why do they work? What things do we have to be absolutely, strict in doing when we're rolling these programs out? What things can we change or modify? We've got enough stuff now, and we've got a global alliance of anti-stigma programs that are starting to think about how to best adapt and replicate programs. We've got global collaborations for data collection on stigma related to depression and schizophrenia. There's an Aspen network and an Indigo network run out of the UK, Institute of Psychiatry. We've developed tools. Social media is going to be an important tool in the future because it allows people to instantaneously mount a protest effort if they don't like something that they see. And so far, there have been some successful protests which have changed policies and changed things that stores are doing change the way people are being portrayed, people with mental illnesses. And then, of course, we're looking forward to being able to mount another Together Against Stigma Congress. I'm going to stop there and let you maybe have some time to ask me questions about any of the other projects you think are interesting or about the stigma work. And I'll just close with this picture. Some of you might know what it is, some of you will not, but this is Homewood Health Center. It used to be called a Homewood Sanitarium. And this is the main gate. It just goes up here. And I lived in a Homewood house that was about right here, right on the edge of the grounds. This is called the Manor Building. And so when I looked out my bedroom window, I was looking out onto the Manor Building. I worked my entire, from the time I was old enough to work till I was well into university in one or another capacities in this hospital. At one point, I thought I could probably run it quite handily because I'd been in so many places, although I never did manage to get into dietary, so I wasn't quite sure about that. But I think this is what taught me about social distance. The people and the patients in this hospital were my neighbors and friends. And I would, play tennis on the tennis courts. It was a private hospital, so it was really quite, plush. But they would all come and they would play tennis with us. Some of them would catch the balls that we went over the net. We'd skate in the winter. We'd, go for walks. And I never understood until about high school that other people didn't see these folks in the same way that I did. I didn't see them as a threat. I saw them as my friends. When I got married, they threw me a wedding shower. So it was like the old days of a therapeutic community. So I think when I look back over my work and my ideas, I think so many of them came from my experience with Homewood. Now I recognize stigma. I didn't see it in myself back then. They were my friends. Sort of like a small family network of folks. And I think that those experiences have carried through in everything that I've done since in my work. So I'll stop there and let people interject or have an early lunch, whatever you prefer.
Heather, I wonder if you could stop sharing your screen and then we can see the faces.
Okay, stop share. Fantastic. Good. Yeah, you can see hands too this way.
Okay. Any hands?
Or chat questions as well. If people don't want to put their hands up.
Well, I'll start. As such an incredible journey, Heather, and thank you for sharing it with us. I guess my question, and I'm not sure I'm going to express it well, within the past or currently we're really trying to address issues related to equity, diversity, inclusion, and indigeneity, I can say. Where does stigma fit into all of that?
Oh, everywhere. It's like it's a cross-cutting theme. And I think what's even more interesting to think about where it fits, I mean, it's driving a lot of this stuff. And the intersectionality is also, there. So people are in more than one vulnerable group sometimes. But I think what's more interesting is to say, what can we learn from the mental health stigma world about interventions that might work in some of these other areas? And I think the one thing that I would say that we could translate very easily is the importance of positive social contact and having opportunities for people who are in, the main group. Interact with folks, interact with people who are Indigenous and understand their stories and their lives, interact with people who are new immigrants to Canada. And I think that, the original social inclusion theories were developed in the 50s around race and desegregation, and they've stood the test of time. So I think stigma is everywhere and it's driving a lot of this stuff. And I think we could learn a lot from what we've done in the mental health world around providing opportunities for social contact and social connections to help make some of the social distance go away.
Yeah. And just to plug for ICES, I know there is an investigator at Western who evaluated the impact of Bell Let's Talk on mental health visits. And it was an incredible use of the data and they found that there was decreased, I think, mental health visit calls, or I forget the details. So it's a nice marriage between a marketing intervention and assessment or evaluation.
Has that been published? I haven't seen it.
Oh, good question. I know them. I'll find out for you, Heather.
Or maybe just yeah. It's interesting about Bell Let's Talk because it's coming under criticism from various viewpoints that it's a way that Bell is marketing itself. And it's in part true. I mean, you know, you're using the Bell network, but it's also doing some very good things, and it's developing a fund that can be used to put money into the community for mental health issues that policymakers have never, ever done. I mean, they've never given this much money, over $100 million to date. And it's also interesting because it's one of the only population-based campaigns that I've seen that has a behavioral outcome. So it's asking people to do something, and it has an immediate indicator. You can count the money. So, you know, it's really unique in that respect. And it's not too different from Ronald McDonald House or, you know, Tim Horton cookies. People use these, what they can do to try to do something good for the community, but also to raise profile for their, you know, their products. So it's an interesting, I'm going to look for, here's the article, fantastic. Somebody's giving it to me. I'll be really interested to read that.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk, Heather. Always interesting to hear from you. And your take on Bell. Surely large corporations don't do anything with you know, without their own image in mind, but I applaud their getting into it as you do. I had a question about evaluation. You talked about evaluation of how these small community-oriented programs or things are being evaluated. I don't know how you'd be able to do that. I was interested in that.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you one example, and this is an example that Michelle used in her thesis, her PhD thesis. So there are programs dotting the country that they're called Talking About Mental Illness, TAMI programs, and they get people who are in recovery, they train them, and then they get schools to invite them in to the classrooms to talk to the students. And so these were going on in all kinds of places. So through the Mental Health Commission, we created a network of these programs, and we paired them with researchers. We did this in various areas, schools, workplaces, you know. And so Michelle and I had the schools, and what we did is we went in, we had a pre-test that we gave the students before they got the educational sessions, and we did a post-test. The teachers did a post-test at the end. And it's very simple evaluation work, pre-test, post-test, but we found that in schools, as in so many workplaces, they couldn't manage anything more than that. And so, you know, randomized control trials are beyond them. They would never be able to do it. So we ended up with, oh gosh, Michelle, are you still on? Do you remember the N size for that? It was huge. And we were able to look at pre and post differences. And Michelle's thesis was based on it, and we've got a couple of chapters in a book that's just recently come out that a colleague and I edited. Not only did we have to develop a scale and test it because there wasn't anything out there, but then we had to implement it. So, you know, given that we're at the beginning of time trying to figure out, is this working at all? The next step would be to do something much more systematic and rigorous. But once we do that, we lose the feel for how things are working in the field. And because programs did things in different ways, we could see variation across the program. So we could see that there are certain key ingredients that need to be there in order for a program to have a successful outcome. And having an opportunity for students to have conversations with the presenter were really important. Some programs were herding 500 and 600 kids into an auditorium or a theater, putting on a play and then saying, okay, let's talk. Kids just wouldn't, ask questions in that circumstance. But you get 20 or 25 kids in a classroom where their teacher has prepared them well for a speaker. They love to ask questions. What is it like to hallucinate? You were on the streets in Vancouver. Tell me about that. They ask such really interesting questions. So we don't have all of the answers, but that was the model that we used, is developing networks, getting them to collect data, sending the data to the research team. We do, basic analyses as best we can, and we feed the information back to the programs. They use it to modify their activities, and we use it to try to understand what works and what doesn't.
I thank you for that answer. I have a follow-up question. I understand how you're doing that evaluation now. I have to believe that the COVID pandemic has not been helpful in these face-to-face interactions, these opportunities for small groups to get together to help people understand this.
I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of it came to a grinding halt. Maybe some people tried to pivot, like we all have to go to Zoom platforms, but many of these are small advocacy groups in the community, and they don't have Zoom money. So I think one of the things that we'll all see as we resume lives, normal lives, is we'll see these things starting up again. And it's good that they do, because they're really needed. We want to get school boards engaged. So right now, you're invited in because a teacher is interested. But we want school boards to make this available to all students. So we need to change the way they do things. It's going to be harder so.
No question. Thank you again.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, Heather, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise. Very, very thoughtful, and it certainly got me thinking.
Good.
So thank you. Just to let people know that probably in a nice follow-up to this, that Dr. Brooke Linden will be building on Heather's work and sharing her work with us in 2 weeks, 3 weeks.
Oh, fantastic! I thought it was longer, but that's great.
On March 23rd. So we'll build upon this story.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for your attention and
Thanks.
comments.
Bye.
Bye.